not concerned with being a good American. That's been ruined. That kind of language has been spoiled for us. Good American. You know, all the worst people are good Americans. Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. I think H.L. Mencken said that. I feel very American. You know, when I'm in a foreign country, I'm amazed at how American I am in my reactions. But really, if there's one thing I love about this country, and I do love it, it's the absolute sense of freedom that I've had all my life to say what I think. You pay a price for saying what you think, but it's not a crippling price. It's not a mortal price. I've felt free to think in this country. Well, I grew up in Brooklyn. You see, you have to understand something in the nature of American capitalism that not everybody talks about all the time. But we are very much a Christian nation, maybe more than any nation in Europe. Nations in Europe, like France, are Catholic, but they're accustomed to that Catholicism. They were living with it for centuries. It's one of the ingredients. It's like having mountains or valleys. It's there, but you don't fight to the death for your mountains or your valleys necessarily if they've been there for forever. And so, but in America, Christianity is a vital force. More Americans than not are probably devout Christians one way or another. And so what happens is the basic belief in Christianity is that you shouldn't be too wealthy. I mean, that's the fundament of Christianity, that the poor come first. And here America was getting rich at a great rate, and part of our ethic, part of our American ethic is that enrich yourself. It's very important. Capitalism depends upon people wanting to enrich themselves. And so there's this fundamental conflict built into the American character. We don't feel good about ourselves when we get rich, but on the other hand, we have to get rich or we have no value for ourselves. So you might say if you dare to speak of the American neurosis, it's this, that we've got to be rich, and yet a deep part of us is ashamed of being rich. And so communism filled the bill perfectly, because it was all right to get rich if you were fighting a force that was evil that would destroy Christianity. And so this propaganda was built up by every means, and very intelligent, powerful people were behind it. What I did during that period is I wrote 2 novels. I wrote Barbary Show. People in America always identify with the president. It's quite different from Europe, where most people wouldn't for a moment think of themselves as being like the president. Here, our president is the equivalent of royalty for us.
First citizen out in Harrisburg to welcome home their first citizen, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Whoever the president was created the prevailing mood in the country. Eisenhower was a WASP. Eisenhower was a man who represented regularity, security, calm, lack of imagination. What he suggested to the country was, if you're not too imaginative, you'll do better than if you are imaginative. This is what came off him. This is how people reacted.
We're going to have a united front this November that's going to assure the victory for General Eisenhower that the country needs.
Victory for the party, and what is more important for the country, my boy.
In 1954 and 55, when the Deer Park came out, was the period in which I turned around. I suddenly realized I've been talking like a radical all these years, but I haven't really felt like a radical. I really felt as if I was part of them. I'm part of the publishers. I'm part of the whole literary establishment. And I'm not. When push comes to shove, they're willing to get rid of me. And I was in a deep rage. I came in contact for the first time in my life with the depth of my own rage. And it was large. After all, what's the use of being a writer if you can't irritate a great many people? The shits are, we have grown up in a world more in decay than the worst of the Roman Empire. We want the heats of the orgy and not its murder. The warmth of pleasure without the grip of pain. And therefore the future threatens a nightmare, and we continue to waste ourselves. I was running into Houston to get more and more violent. You know, we are as ugly as the animals in our fashion. And unless we deal with the ugliness in ourselves, unless we deal with the violence in ourselves, the brutality in ourselves, and find some way to sublimate it, just to use Freud's term, into something slightly higher, we're never going to get anywhere with anything. There's a dream life in America. And I felt that Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy were closer to that dream life, or that Richard Nixon would be. And What it meant to me was that, precisely because of their youth and their good looks, we're going to encourage, willy-nilly, whether they chose to or not, an opening in America, a return to the sense of oneself as a human animal who lived in a field of senses. And I was looking for change. I felt the change, you kind of control change. It'll go in all sorts of directions I don't foresee, but that's better than the status quo we're living in. Now, whether I was right or wrong, I could argue over with myself for many years, because Kennedy did make a lot of changes when he came in, not through politics, through his presence. When I wrote about Kennedy, that politics became existential for me. In other words, I'd come to the point where I felt that originally as a Marxist, I'd felt, well, individuals are not really very important in history. And the great change in my political thinking was, with Kennedy, I decided, yes, individuals are immensely important in history. I never saw Kennedy as a politician that I was in agreement with. I saw him as an active agent, as a catalyst, if you will, that would accelerate a great many trends in American life. I was scorching at what I had to write at that time about Kennedy.
We have a president who is brave but politically neuter, adept at obtaining power and a miser at spending it, an intellectual with a mind like a newspaper's yearbook and a blank, somewhat stricken expression about the eyes. A numbed mind seems to speak behind them. A president is supposed to enrich the life of his people. The mind which looks out from this president's eyes has lost the way. The expression lives in all the dull avenues of precedent. So here is a book of presidential papers about all the topics a president ought to consider and rarely does, and some of the topics he considers every day, but rarely, in a fashion which is fresh. Here are some of its topics: capital punishment, censorship, drug addiction, juvenile delinquency, America's need for a hero, political conventions, the CIA, Castro, the black bourgeoisie, the Negro emergence, fallout shelters, the First Lady as a television entertainer, the First Lady as a hostage, the nature of the Jews, the nature
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know...
Quite unconsciously, to Clinton in the same way. There was a notion that he was this pharaoh with this immense phallus, and that he was going to be good for America. And the fact that he had many women, it didn't matter. Ramses II had also had many women, something like 100 wives and 500 concubines and 1,000 children. So that gave Clinton this great strength. All the things that the Republicans have been trying to destroy him by, with his sex life, was now his strength. People just adore him. Now, they adore him for two reasons. One is because he gives them a certain immoral sanction. That is, people feel, gee, I'm not really very good in my own life. I'm kind of shitty when you get down to it. You know, I'm cheating on my wife, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing that. And I borrowed some money from a friend the other day, and I don't even know if I'll ever pay it back. I'm not really a very nice guy. I'm no good, and I can prove it. People think. And they say, look at the president. He's just like me. He's no good, and he can prove it. And it gives them a comfortable feeling. They like him. You know, they feel things are possible for me. If a guy that lousy could get to be president, maybe I can get to be president too. Now, there are other people who venerate the presidency, and they're sick over Clinton. Their feeling is the country is being dragged down by Clinton, and probably it is. There's a chance the presidency will never have the luster again that it had before Nixon and Clinton. So is that good or bad for the country? I have no idea. You know, I'm not one to revere my leaders. So I've always found there was much too much garbage associated with the presidency. Much too much, like garbage, by garbage I mean cheap piety, reflexive piety. You know, the president walks in and by God, everyone's, you know, comes to attention and salutes. Well, you know, having not enjoyed the army all that much, I don't know that that's my idea of an exciting society. We're very far away from the new frontier now. The new frontier now is money and more money and more money. And we've lost a lot of other values en route. If we are, by our economic wealth, the greatest nation in the world, then let's at least become great people within that country. And that we have not done. You know, and if anything, life in America is getting more and more loutish all the time, noisier, more stupid. My country has not become as great and as noble as I wanted it to become. Naturally, as you get older, you have other things in your life besides your country. I'm not going to pretend this is the country is the center of my life. But, you know, I have my work, I have my children, I have my present wife. I have a lot of things, so I don't consider myself a miserably unhappy man. I don't consider myself profoundly depressed. But if there's anything that does depress me, it's picking up the paper and seeing what's going on in this country every day. But I certainly do have this feeling of affection for the absolute sense of intellectual freedom that exists as a live nerve, a live wire, right through the center of American life. Every time I get totally discouraged with this country, I remind myself, no, the fact is that finally is that we really can say what we think, and some extraordinary things that come out of that. I have the hope that this book may stimulate